or something, usually for them, I think I'll charge like 15 bucks an acre is what I've done. Just usually asking around, it's like, hey, what so-and-so charge you? And you just kind of do what your neighbors do. But again, it's not really as a cover crop seeding business. It's more just, hey, I'm able to get a little bit extra use out of my drill during a time of the year when maybe it's a little bit slow. You know, if they ask me, hey, would you want to do this during the fall? Like, no, I have my own cover crops to seed, sorry. But I think another thing that I thought in the past that would be a pretty decent business venture if someone were looking into doing it is like where you have the cover crop seeding, like you're saying, being a one-stop shop. You know, Missouri has like a really good cost share program, like the SWCP cost share program, I think, where they pay either, I think it's 30 bucks an acre for a single 1 or 2 species mix, and then like 40 bucks an acre for a multi-species. You do have to go out there and take like a soil ring and drive it in the ground to get like these density tests. And I've heard from seed dealers before, they'd have farmers come by buying seed and they're like, oh, they want me to drive this ring in the ground and take these tests. And it's like, well, they're paying you, you kind of got to do something. I mean, come on, can't get money for nothing. But you know, if you had someone who's like, hey, I will do the paperwork for you, I'll do these tests for you, I'll get your seed organized. You know, I think there might be some farmers or landowners out there who are unaware of these programs, but if they just had someone who is willing to be the gopher and do all those things, you know, maybe they'd be like, hey, I'll pay even a little extra because I'm getting paid money anyway to put these cover crops out there. You know, kind of be a win-win in that sense. You know, it maybe even soften the blow of having to hire someone done because they're already getting that cost share money. So I think that might be another opportunity.
Very good. Who's got another question? Thank you, Michael. Yes, sir.
So how does everybody manage their cover crops, especially during wet springs? So we have a lot of, which is very foreseeable this spring, and once again with the soil moisture that we have and the rain and the snow melt that's coming, obviously different up in other areas as well. And especially this year too, we had a lot of, with the last year's prevented planted acres, we have a lot of new cover croppers that didn't really expect to be cover croppers this year. So they'll be looking for, you know, termination advice and so forth. And so what would you tell those farmers and others out there how to manage their cover crops in the spring when it could be very wet?
Keith, we want to start with you and we'll just go around the horn.
I'm gonna go from last year. We seeded a lot of rye cover crops and it rained. And if anybody knows it rained, and it rained. And it was June before I got started. By the time I got my second go around of corn planted and grain sorghum and went to go plant soybeans, well, the rye had had seeded. And so I decided, well, I was gonna harvest the rye, because that caused some excitement with FSA and the crop insurance, because now you hadn't reported that you planted rye. There was a lot of those that worked out okay. And so this year, we planted seeded rye as a cover crop with the intention of maybe we'll harvest it. The terminating things, I usually don't worry about that too much. Although I did learn something today that growing barley is sometimes pretty hard to kill. I picked up at the last session that Lamoxone and Select will kill that. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm going back to putting some barley in my mix because I like what it looks like. But talk to some people that have done it. I just don't worry about how tall it gets or anything. I just plant it and spray it. Once it's knocked down, it don't bother you at harvest.
Well, up until 2019 or the fall of 2019, every one of the cover crops not every one, but most of my cover crops had all been planted to graze or to harvest in the spring. And so, you know, if I graze it going into spring, it's usually pretty short and I can terminate it early. Or more often than not, I decide, well, why would I kill this crop that's paid for in order to plant one that might break even? So I just wait and I'll harvest it in late May or early June and then go plant corn. 2019, we managed to get rye in every single acre. And so my plan is to plant green on most of that and burn it down immediately after that. Last summer we tried that once. I did a small experiment. I don't have a crop roller, but I do have a VT machine. And so we just cranked it all the way to the back and used the baskets to roll that crop. Well, it took an hour to do 20 acres, but it took 3 hours to unplug the baskets. And then it rained that night before we got it planted, and it was another month getting it to dry out because we had already rolled it. And so I guess I'm of the opinion that if you're rolling it, you better be in there right now planting or have a great 8-day forecast, because otherwise you can run into some troubles.
Yeah, I'd say for us, on managing cover crops in a wet year, which, I mean, I guess in some ways in terms of like just, you know, when you plant your crop and everything, I mean, when the ground's fit to plant, it's fit to plant, and so, which that's going to be the same case whether it's conventional tilled ground, no-till with no cover crops. You know, we always on our cover crop have always planted green, just because going to a couple meetings, they just said that was the easiest way to manage it, because if you sprayed it and then you got a rain and you had this dead or half dead mat of residue on top of it, it's gonna lock your moisture in, and then you're not gonna be able to get into plant because, you know, you just have all this straw on top. And likewise, that having that dead, stemmy, I mean, depending on how tall your rye gets, or whatever cover crop you're using, sometimes when it's brown and then you're running the planter through it, it actually doesn't cut nearly as easily as if you just left it green and had a lot more moisture in the plant tissue. So, I mean, for us, it's just, you know, watch the forecast. And again, we're on our farm, most of our cover crop situation is not before corn, it's going to be before soybeans, a small grain crop like rye or triticale. You know, once it's fit to plant, then we just go in and start planting, and then we run our own sprayer, so then once it's planted, we spray. So if we were to ever spray, which we have done before planting soybeans, it's like you're saying, if you know that the forecast looks good, there is no chance for rain, if you know that you can get it planted as soon as you have committed to terminating that cover crop, then we'll do it. But usually just the way things pan out, we figure, well, let's go ahead and at least get the beans in the ground first, and then worry about killing the cover crop after that. Because we've even had situations before where, you know, maybe, you know, the operator of the spray coop missed a spot in the field and got to go back and, you know, hit a little area, and maybe the beans are already up and out of the ground, but, you know, we've been able to kill cover crop that's, you know, hadn't been sprayed, but the beans are already up, and, you know, if they're a Roundup resistant bean, you know, you can use some Roundup or something like a Select or any of the clethodim products that kill grass like that.
I'd say termination is one of the big puzzles of this whole deal, and a couple of situations where we have cover crops planted on silage ground, corn silage ground, planted late summer, or where we've got wheat stubble we planted cover crops into. We're planting things that would include oats, for example, brassicas. You get all of that extended growth because of the longer window, and a lot of those things that we plant there are things that winter kill. So those generally for us have been beautiful planting conditions in the spring, at just really great soil condition. On the other hand, when you have rye that you've planted after soybean or corn harvest, and come spring, your plants need to be pretty flexible. We've had real challenges getting that sprayed when we wanted it sprayed. So I think last spring we planted, virtually every acre of beans we had. You pulled in with a planter, you didn't see the planter until you pulled out of the field. It was so tall. And it's doable. It's doable. We've moved pretty slowly into green planting, but on the soybean into rye, we've done it, you know, maybe not because we chose that way, but planting into green planting corn into rye. Naturally, at corn planting time for us, that rye is not very big, and we've not gone very far into that concept, because typically we're terminating rye where we're planting corn. It's going to be terminated when it's very small. So we're just going ahead and putting on residuals in those corn acres and killing that rye when it's pretty little.
Let me just follow up kind of.
Actually, I have one more thing I want to
Yeah,
add,
Michael.
because it kind of touches on what Paul Yassa had in his presentation about on the coulters on the planter. We've taken the coulters off of our planter, and I think we have noticed an improvement in seed to soil contact, because when we started with doing cover crops, we had the 13 wave wavy coulters, And sometimes we'd notice those coulters that seem to want to like dig into a root ball of the rye and just kind of rip the whole thing up and just kind of plug things up either with stems or mud and things like that. And I think removing that for us has helped. Also with planting in conditions where, you know, maybe you go out there and you dig around in the soil and there's moisture, it doesn't want to, you know, clump up and form a mud ball when you press it in your hand. But if you have, you know, some implement like the coulters that's really digging and causing a lot of disturbance, moisture and wetness might give you more of a problem. Whereas removing those and just relying solely on your double disc openers, I think that's been a huge help for us.
So I'll also add, I think we need to quit getting so hung up with the calendar and what the neighbor's doing. I mean, some of my best corn this year was planted June 11th, which is almost 3 weeks after my final plant date, and it's a good solid month after I want to be done planting corn. And if you guys recall, last June, corn markets were on a runaway train because, oh, nobody's going to get anything planted and everything's going to be prevented planting and this is going to be a crop failure. And the American farmer's proven that we can raise pretty good crops no matter when we plant them. And so I would just caution you to not get too worried about it and let Mother Nature tell you when you need to be in the field as opposed to the calendar or the neighbor who thinks he's got to plant corn in Kansas on the 15th of March.
Very good, very good. Well, a question I'll throw out, and several of you have mentioned this, and I mentioned it earlier, it's a lot of adoption of cover crops ahead of soybeans. That's where people like to start first. But and Ben, I guess we can just start with you down here and go that way. What are a few tweaks you do when you're planting corn? Is there a favorite mixture? Is there some scenarios you use with termination or with nitrogen management that you do when you're planting corn into cover crops? What would be just kind of like your handful of pointers you'd give to somebody starting off?
Well, I think again, we're terminating cover crops going into corn, and the cover crop's pretty small. One of the things we're doing, which is, I don't know how it's quite related, but we're putting more split applications of nitrogen on. We're moving more of that into the season rather than fall applied. That's not precisely on target with your question, but applying fertilizer, obviously you have to think about when you're doing it, how you're applying it, and that has implications for all of your field work too. I don't think we certainly don't have the answers for how corn responds best in a cover crop environment. I don't, maybe someone will come to me.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, I think for me, and again, it all kind of does depend on the spring, you know, like you're saying, if it's, you know, wet and it's middle April, you know, well, you can't plant even if, you know, you really, really want to plant. But, you know, we have had before corn, if it's a cover crop mix, let's say we planted into a small grain, when we're kind of figuring out that mix, we're probably going to skew heavier toward your brassicas, your legumes, things that are a lower seed-in ratio versus, you know, if we were to have something like sorghum Sudan grass or cereal rye, things like that, you know, try to put a little bit more nitrogen out there relative to carbon if we're going into corn. And I would agree with the split applications of nitrogen. You know, sometimes we maybe even need to put a little bit of supplemental nitrogen out there just to offset all that extra carbon out there, which, you know, some folks might think, well, you know, I just increase my inputs, I'm supposed to decrease them. Well, I mean, it's getting tied up by a living plant and all those microbes, so it's going to be returned to you at some point in the future. You're kind of adding to your soil bank account. So yes, you did have to maybe put a few more units of N out there to compensate for that, but it's help building things for the long term. So those would probably be the two for me.
Okay, thanks. Sean, your experience?
My experience is probably a little bit different. I'm almost always going into cover crop with corn. I don't raise hardly any beans because it's hard to feed a bean to a steer. And I'm usually terminating a cover crop with a bovine or a swather. You know, so I don't maybe have some of those challenges, or I haven't. I'm gonna this year. I'm gonna have to figure that out because there's no way I can chop every cover crop I got planted this year. I mean, we got every acre covered. We managed to. So, but I don't Yeah, for corn, I think it's pretty simple. I think when you get into some of your legumes and some of that, you gotta worry about some herbicide issues, which I know was one of the topics earlier today. That's where you've gotta be thinking ahead.
Man, over the years, we've kind of got down to need a starter inroad, a little P&K. My soil test called for a couple of micros. I put that in there. We used to put like 120 pounds of N on behind the planter, and I'm down to 60, and we're still thinking we'll put too much on in the spring, and then we watch and try to side dress then later. And from that, and the totals over the years, we've dropped our fertilizer needs almost against about 30%. And our yields have actually been climbing. I think I was just putting too much on at first. Yeah, just try things. Okay? I would try, I'd run some at 20 pounds and some at 40 and some at 60. And then you just look at what you had and like, that didn't work. So little strip trials, and it's pretty easy with, just you can have 6 or 7 of them in very few, little bit of time.
Do a little experiment there, that's good. Who's got a question? Yes, sir.
I got a comment, and I got a negative one and a positive one.
Okay.
If I came here looking for an excuse not to cover crop, I found it. Virtually every speaker has talked about cover crop incorporating livestock. I don't do livestock. I think a cow hoof is the most effective soil compaction tool ever invented. I don't let cows on my property if I can help it. So I'm not going to go ahead and incorporate livestock. Now, other than Paul, virtually everybody has talked about the benefits of cover crops going with livestock. What about a guy that's not gonna do livestock?
Can I respond to that?
You bet.
Yeah, we milk cows and dairy, but we don't graze any of our livestock on our cover crops. So in a sense, I'm kind of in that category. I'm not grazing any of my cover crops. I am telling you that our soil organic matter levels have gone up every year gradually since we've been doing this. So for us, there's been a benefit beyond grazing. I'm confident in that. It's definitely helped our winter annual control. There are a whole list of benefits which many speakers have gone over today. And there's a lot of body of research that says, for that matter, that grazing and compaction are not an issue. I haven't had personal experience with it, but we've had plenty of research around those ideas. So, and furthermore, if you're a producer without livestock or fences, which would be me, I don't have beef cattle, and I don't have any fences. Well, there are people that do, and they will build an electric fence, and they will bring their cattle, and they will pay you to let them do it. So you don't have to, you don't have to. But if you want to capture some extra benefits in soil organic matter, in weed control, erosion control, all of those benefits to the agronomics, and if you want to help somebody else get started in agriculture, and if you want to make some money, renting your grazing, those are all things you can choose to do.
Certainly, there's, I was just gonna comment that certainly it's around management, a lot of it has to do with that. But to the question, so again, what are some things for non-livestock ground that are benefits that you've seen?
Yeah, no, and I mean, for me, where we do, like I would say, we do incorporate livestock when we can, that's still not on the bulk of our acres. Like at the main home farm where we have, most of our fields really don't have access to livestock. Yeah, we still do cover crop. I guess it was kind of a 4-year period, I think, from like 2012 to 2016, we were one of 4 farms that participated in this case study that the National Association of Conservation Districts did with this research outfit out of North Carolina. And basically they were just tallying up, the costs and benefits of cover crops. And, it's something that we were already committed to doing anyway because we'd seen the erosion control benefits. You know, just even digging around in the soil when, you know, following behind the planter, it just looked better, it smelled better, so I thought, okay, the soil looks better. But, you know, we gave them our record keeping and, you know, what we did before cover crops versus after, you know, yields, inputs, things like that, and, you know, they were tallying up basically that even, you know, just on row crop ground alone, that there still was a monetary benefit to the cover crops. I think it netted about to like $15 an acre in the positive, you know, after factoring your seeding costs, you know, running the drill, the cost of seed. They even factored in the cost of like going to meetings and just, you know, the time invested in learning. But then with the yield benefits, the input cuts that you did, and this was before factoring in cost share. Once you factor in cost share, then it definitely helped pay for it. But even without cost share added in there, in those first, you know, 2 years, the cover crops are already paying for themselves, and that's not even including livestock or anything like that. And because in all honesty, on our operation, we're still just kind of getting into incorporating livestock, because, you know, you'll go to these meetings and you'll see folks like Gabe Brown and things like that, and I'll be like, gosh, I feel kind of inadequate. We're just, you know, we just turn the cows out and let them have the whole run of the place. I'm kind of a schmuck. Geez, I'm not even near the level of that going, so I'm kind of, geez, what the heck am I doing? I need to get in gear here. But, you know, it's one of those things where you just kind of gradually incorporate over time. And when it comes to compaction, which, you know, I think there can, you know, sometimes you'll see issues with it, sometimes you won't. This year was kind of to help sort of spur us along incorporating livestock more and doing more of that mob grazing. We were participating in a project that dealt with, you know, basically daily moves and moving your livestock like that. And where it was a wet year, they were out there grazing during a time when it was really wet. And so there was only one access point where they could get to water. And there was, it wasn't a very large area, you know, maybe no bigger than just that section of tables over there, but they had just turned the entire field into just a rutted loblolly, like you had just walked through it knee deep into mud and water and thought, oh my God, I've ruined this field. Why have we done this? But it dried up, we put our beans in the ground, looking at the yield monitor, everything, the beans did no worse in that area than they would relative to the rest of the field. You know, you couldn't have told, based on the yield monitor, that there's anything different. Granted, there's a year with plenty of moisture. Maybe if it had dried up, maybe it would have been a difference. I don't know. But it was one of those things where it just showed how resilient the soil was.
I think I can speak for all four of us up here when I say two things. I hope that nothing that I say ever discourages somebody from doing cover crops. And the second thing is, I hope that nobody thinks that the way I'm doing it in my system is the only way to do it. You know, every one of our operations is different. If anybody's gonna have compaction issues, it's me, because I've got silage trucks on the field, I got manure trucks on the field, I got cattle on the field, but I wear both hats. I would say less than 25% of my acres are grazable, whether there's fence or water. I'm running a 30,000 head cattle feeding operation in the wintertime that's completely full. I don't have time to truck water, I don't have time to build fence. We kick them out and we stock it heavy, we graze it down in 60 days and we get off. And do I create some compaction? Maybe. If they congregate in a field corner or at the mineral feeder or on the way to water, maybe. And if I have to fix that, I go fix that on an as needed basis in that spot. I don't go blanket the whole field with whatever I'm doing to fix that one little high traffic area. But I guess I'll end with this. I feel like the cover crops and our soil structure that the cover crops have given us has made us less susceptible to that compaction. So my dad's our custom silage chopper. And when it was so wet last year, he said, I can't believe we're not hurting your fields. He says, we're not even leaving a track. And he said, we go down the road 5 miles and we're literally dragging the silage trucks through the field because there's no soil structure there. And so if your soils are right, it gets pretty tough.
Keith, how about you?
Sean and I talked about this earlier, and then we'll move on to one other thing. But when we first brought cattle into the operation, I was concerned about that, soil compaction. And I remember I said, never had any cattle till my son brought them in. And so I really watched those fields. And remember, these have been fields that have been at that time been 20 years of no-till. We've been having cover crops on them. He was grazing the cattle there, take them off, and invariably, those fields would yield one of the highest yields they'd ever made. At first, I thought I was just, I imagined this, but year after year, I see the same thing. When we have the cattle, that field yields extra good. But going on that, if you don't want to have cattle, I have nothing against it. I only guess 50% of our acres get cattle on them. We have a lot of let people, and farms that we own just don't work out. It follows first four soil health principles: the living root, the armor of the soil, plenty of diversity, and don't work the ground. You're getting 80%. And I don't know if the cattle actually, it ends up being another moneymaker. And the other thing that we've done is with the perennial pastures, taking cropland turned into a perennial pasture and then bring that out. Those fields I've been through one rotation with that, so I'm curious to see how the next one works. But that farm yielded the highest yields it's ever made when we brought it out from the cattle after 4 years. Been in a perennial, it's sort of a perennial we planted back and forth. But for 4 years, for 365 days a year, something green was growing on that baby all the time.
Great. Well, thank you for your answers. There was some good comments, both with cover crops, with livestock and without livestock. So, and sir, you mentioned you had two things. You said you had one that was negative and one that was positive.
Well.
Was there another one?
Yeah, on the positive, I wanted to see what kind of response I'd get. The other thing is, I've been no-tilling for a long time. I've tried cover crops. I've listened to Paul a lot. And I've got a good friend that, I don't know how many thousand acres he's cover cropping. But he doesn't do livestock, so he's my mentor. So I knew I was gonna get some reaction, and I appreciate it.
Just testing, huh? Okay.
Well,
Thank you,
sir, as you know, if you've been doing cover crops, at some point in your cover crop journey, you've been the village idiot. And so you've got to get pretty thick-skinned, and you've got to be able to answer tough questions.
You all did great. You did great. So just maybe a wrap up, and did you have,
I did have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Pertaining to corn production, we're trying to, everybody pretty much said we're trying to do the least amount of disturbance and no-till. How are you guys, what kind of nitrogen source are you using have you found a way to do that without having to run an injector unit through the soil?
So questions around nitrogen source for corn after cover crops, and do you inject nitrogen? How do you do it? Just real quick.
My favorite's poop, but I have a lot of it. We used to use anhydrous, and my plan was in 2019 to split apply anhydrous versus urea. Not split apply, but split my acres. And it was just too wet, and I felt like that was the Lord telling me to just go all in. And Ray Ward used to have my mentality that if your soils are healthy, anhydrous isn't hurting your microbial population too much and it rebounds quickly. But I've just gotten to the point in my system where that microbial activity, the biology in the soil is so important to me. I'm no longer going to do anything that's detrimental to it. And so we've gone. Now, I have the luxury that I've never applied any P&K to my acres. We get that all through the manure or compost, so I'm just applying nitrogen. And this last year, I'm like Keith. I think we've been applying way too much. I raised 130 bushel dryland corn in Morris County, Kansas, 6-inch deep soils with 50 units of nitrogen. Now, I had manure, and we used a biological foliar feed. But I am going to drive, and I'm doing Haney tests. And so this year I do have acres that the Haney test showed I don't need any nitrogen, any fertility whatsoever. And so I'm going to trust those Haney tests this year. And if the crop tells me in season it needs nitrogen, I'll put it out there. But I'm coming to the realization that none of us would get up on Monday morning and eat a massive meal and expect to be able to make it till the next Monday morning. But that's what we do in our cropping systems. We give it a huge meal, and eat sometimes in the falls, months before we plant it, or weeks before we plant it, and we expect it to go through the season. And I think spoon feeding it is important. so.
For ours, we actually still do use anhydrous, which again, that's another one where we're just like, maybe we're not as good on it as we thought we were, but, on the other hand, I mean, we haven't seen any detriment to it. I mean, granted, it's, one of the cheapest forms you can find, but again, there are the concerns about, what it can do to your soil biology. And we also have done fields before where, we've only done dry broadcast urea, and, it maybe didn't perform as well yield-wise as some of the anhydrous fields, but not nearly by much. And maybe, again, it's just something where as we continue to cover crop, continue to build the fields up, and if we added more diversity, that would improve in that regard. But, for us, we still do anhydrous, and it does work for us. It is convenient. If it did come to where we had to do it ourselves, because we only have just the local co-op do it, but if we had to do it ourselves and had to run all the equipment, then we'd probably just go just a straight top dressing, dry urea for ourselves, so.
Ben, Keith, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would just say we've shifted. Years ago, we were all anhydrous in the fall. We're in a transition over a long process, but we're putting less and less on in the fall, and given the right conditions or the wrong conditions, however you want to put it, we've put all dry urea on in the spring. Sometimes I'm not a fan of putting anhydrous on in the spring in our soil types and situations, so I really don't like to do that. And I really would prefer to knife or get the nitrogen in the soil rather than top dress, than put it on top of the ground. So I think we're headed in the direction of knifing in or rolling in liquid. I think that's liquid or dry, but probably knifing it in somehow.
And I'd also add our anhydrous, it's spring applied, that's how we've always done ours, so one of those, just kind of how it's always worked for us. But again, like this past year, and it's kind of looking like this year, it can kind of create some headaches. Sometimes there are some spots that go through in the field that's a little bit wet and has some compaction. So again, we might end up having a situation where just the way things turn out, we switch to doing something different just because of how the season plays out. So yeah, every year's different.
You bet. Keith?
We used to use anhydrous, and I quit before the whole thing about worrying about the biology. That was, at that time I quit, that wasn't in my thought process brain. But the reason we quit was completely different, is we were using these long-term breaks. We'd go at least 4 years before we plant corn or green sorghum. And I put my anhydrous on. I did that it took 2 years to dawn on me that when I put the anhydrous on, I had a weed problem and I could see it in streaks. And my anhydrous knives were pulling up weeds that I had completely. We were cutting back on herbicides and everything. Like we thought we knew what we were doing. So I put the anhydrous on and I said, hey, I'm done with anhydrous. That's the reason I gave it up. That was my reasoning. We went to, we use almost all liquid.
Very good.
On top?
I usually stream it behind, if it's liquid, behind the planter. I'm beginning to think that I need to be getting it in the soil. I think that's one of our things that we see. Every so often, we see a failure. I wouldn't say a failure, but the corn doesn't yield like you think it should. So I think getting it in the ground, and then if we do use urea, use Agritain or something, things like that. I always use a nitrogen inhibitor, no matter how I do it.
I agree with Agritain 100%.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're up at our time. Isn't this group great? You did a great job. Let's give them a big one. I think we could probably all stay here and listen to them for another hour, but I know there's some snow out there, and it's time to close up shop. So thank you all again. You did a great job, learned a lot of things, and some good advice. So who's got the